Here's a guy who thinks that logic has to come from God.
I have a great big question for atheists. Is logic something we have discovered, or is logic something that mankind has created?
In a sense, it's both. Logic is a set of rules that describe how human minds seem to work. It delineates the borders between what we can make sense of and what we can't make sense of. Because it is a description of the functioning of the human mind, it is a consequence of the existence of the human mind. In that sense, we created it. Logic is also a discovery in the sense that we discover logic as we explore how our own minds work.
You know, we've had thousands of years of discussion, all the way from Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle to our present day. And we've had all this time to analyze and to understand what logic is. So, with our great big intellects, what is it? Is it something we have discovered, or is it something that we create?
Because it is a description of how human minds work, it is a consequence of the existence of human minds, and in that sense, it is something that we create. As we observe how our minds work, we make discoveries about the logic that our minds create.
And if it is something that we have discovered, then how did it get there? How did it come to pass? And
it developed as our minds developed. It developed through evolution.
Being what it is, how is it so consistent?
It's not as consistent as you seem to think it is. If it were entirely consistent, there would be no distinction between Aristotelian logic and Boolean logic.
Precise, like atoms in a molecular compound as it is working together. I mean, with such amazing precision. How is logic already like that?
You seem to be pointing to the existence of order and regularity and asking why it exists. This is yet another example of an apologist assuming that the default state of reality is chaos and that order can only exist if it is deliberately imposed by a conscious mind. There is no reason to assume this at all.
If it is something that we have discovered, and it also seems that logic is immaterial.
No, it doesn't. It is a description of how we think, and thinking is a physical process carried out by our brains.
Because if it was just material, if it is just, something that we create, then it seems like it came out of man's mind. And man's mind is what just, chemistry and electromagnetism and, these little blurps.
Right, and those things don't behave randomly, so logic is also not random.
And so is it just an order, a progression of things? But logic seems to be more than that, because if you state a man next door, if you say a man next door, that carries with it some kind of meaning, some kind of depth, some kind of truth that is attainable, that is beyond those actual words. Because if I use the other words, the guy in the house beside us, you can come away with the same exact comprehension of a unity between those two.
Yes, words represent concepts. Because concepts are ways of thinking, and thinking is a physical process, we're still not getting beyond the physical here. The fact that you can represent the same concept using multiple different words in no way indicates that concepts or logic are not physical phenomena.
That is very understandable. That is very logical. And so logic seems to be immaterial. It seems to have already existed. It seems to be so precise.
I'm not sure what you mean by already existed. It doesn't pre-exist our minds because it is a description of our minds. The phenomena it describes do pre-exist our descriptions, but those phenomena don't pre-exist our minds because they are mental phenomena.
But all that leads me to a question of why is it even discernible by a human mind? Why can't it exist in some kind of form that we couldn't even grasp it?
Given that it is a description of how human minds work, it seems pretty intuitive to me that human minds would be able to grasp it. Is it really all that surprising that a human mind is able to describe how a human mind behaves?
What makes it a have to that we did discover it, or maybe you think it isn't? But all of this leads me to understand, like, if we have discovered logic, then we are having to make assumptions about logic.
No, we don't have to make assumptions about logic. The reason I believe in, for example, the law of non-contradiction is because I can do a little mental experiment to test it. If I try to imagine something both existing and not existing at the same time and in the same respect, I find that I can't do it. I infer that the law of non-contradiction is correct because it is corroborated by this experiment. It is not because I merely assume it to be correct.
And that's the point I want to take you to, is that if it is something we have discovered, there is no way to know for certain all of those matrices and way more about logic. We're never going to completely grasp all those endless conceptualizing, all this endless conceptualizing around logic. We're just not going to be able to know.
It is perhaps the case that we will never describe everything about what our minds can or cannot make sense of. The same is true of math. Math is also in one sense an invention and in another sense a discovery. We invented the concept of triangles, but we discovered that Pythagorean theorem is an implication of this invention that the first person to think of a triangle probably didn't know about. We can invent things and then make discoveries about what we have invented. We may, however, never discover all of the conceptual implications of these invented mathematical ideas.
If it's something we have discovered, because it is so far outside of our grasp, we can kind of only grasp at it with our mind. And as such, we're going to have to make a lot of assumptions. And how logical is that?
I don't think we have to make assumptions. We have to make inferences, and some of those inferences are inductive, but an inductive inference is not a mere assumption. It's based on evidence. For example, I inductively infer that I will never be able to understand how a self-contradictory claim could be true. This is not an assumption, though, because it is based on consistent experience.
You should really think about that point. Or do we create logic? And so, maybe it's possible that we have created logic. And if that is the case, is logic just more efficient and effective way to think? And if it is, what demands that we be more efficient or effective in our thinking?
Nothing demands it. I apply logic because it is an epistemic tool that most efficiently satisfies my desires. I don't need any demand to motivate me to satisfy my desires. The satisfaction of my desires is inherently motivating.
But something that plagues me more than that is if logic is something that a person has created or a bunch of people have created, then what really gives it any kind of authority?
Nothing. The point of logic is not to establish any kind of authority. The point of logic is to consistently describe the boundary between what seems to be coherent and what doesn't seem to be coherent. People seem to think that logic has authority because folks often wield accusations of fallacious reasoning like rhetorical weapons. But these only work insofar as you can use them to convince your interlocutor that what they have said doesn't make sense or their conclusions don't follow from their premises. If pointing to a logical fallacy doesn't make that clear to them or they don't care, then it is useless in such a circumstance. Strict fideists, for example, know that their beliefs are not logically grounded, but they don't care. It's not like we can sentence them to logic jail for that.
Because there are some people that really lean heavily on the authority of logic. This is logical, so this is the way it is. And
I would never make such an argument. I might, however, argue that a claim is logical, therefore I can't help but believe it because I can't understand what it would mean for it to be false. If I point out that your argument is fallacious, I'm not saying that your conclusion is wrong. To do so would be to commit the fallacy. I'm only saying that it does not convince me.
But if it's just something somebody has thought up, then what gives it any kind of real authority?
It's not something that anyone has merely thought up. It is created by humans in the sense that it is a description of how human minds work, and therefore it is contingent upon the existence of human minds. We don't, however, just make it up arbitrarily. We base it upon observations of how our minds work.
I mean, think about how logic lacks. And here's what I mean by that is, it is graspable by the human mind, and most people have access to the ability to use logic, but logic doesn't really make people logical.
Yeah, we can often reason fallaciously. It's only if we really think carefully that we can catch ourselves making inferences that don't make sense. Affirming the consequent, for example, is a very common formal fallacy. I wouldn't be surprised if we all make that mistake from time to time if we aren't careful.
Further, logic does not guarantee an answer. You can use logic as precisely as you know how and still not come away with a precise answer.
I mean, I suppose if you're missing the necessary premises, that would limit the range of conclusions you can logically draw.
You can dial in logic and never really come up with the right direction or guidance that you need.
Maybe you're talking about making a moral decision. In that sense, that's true because logic can't ground morality. As Hume said, it is not contrary to reason for me to prefer the destruction of the world to the scratching of my finger. Morality has to be based on values rather than merely truths. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.